Welcome to week 2 of our conversation around change. I want to speak to us about change, not just because of what is happening in the wider world, not just because of what is happening within our communities, but I think our relationship with change and our response to that word, to that idea, is going to produce some things in us that are going to look like Jesus, and it's going to produce some things in us that maybe don't look like Jesus. And so the thinking is, the more that we can improve our relationship with the idea of change, how we manage our emotional response to the thought of change, that's going to help us in our response to God and how we follow Jesus in the things that we have been given. And that's where I want to start today. I want us to think about the call to follow Jesus. I would argue that that is an active response. It requires something of us to make a decision to follow Jesus. That's not a passive thing. That's not something that we can be inactive about, but to make disciples, to include others, to invite people to know Jesus, to bless people, to respond to where there is need, to feed people, to clothe people, to serve people, to be in and amongst the things that God has called us to, is an active process. And I think as we respond from where we were and as we follow Jesus, that idea of movement implies and suggests that there will be change. And if God is involved, then that has to be a positive thing. If we are committed to following Jesus, then the change that comes as a consequence, we trust God in that process of change. So we need to manage our response, we need to manage our emotions in light of God-led change, and that gives us the ability to be engaged with God through that process, and not to be fearful of it, not to back away from it, and not to be passive in our engagement with change. I want to encourage you to keep thinking about that process of change. I want you to keep thinking about what that produces in you, and I want you to think about how you follow Jesus, and what does that mean for you? What does that look like in your life? What does that mean to you, and how does that change the way or the things that you do, your processes, your thoughts, your words, your actions? We're familiar with this rhythm and with this idea, and as I have been thinking about these things, and as I have been dwelling on our relationship with change, and how do we look at doing that positively, how do we do that in a way that God is glorified and engaged with that I want to draw our attention to some things that Jesus has said, and some things that we are going to see through Scripture that are challenging and are hard, but we are capable of engaging with them. They are there for us for a reason. They are there to encourage us, to move us closer to God, to help us engage with this process of how we become more like Jesus, how we are apprenticed to Him, and how we follow Him. Jesus in Luke chapter 17 is talking about a lot of things, and I want to encourage you, as you gather with people this week, spend some time in Luke 17. There's lots going on. There's lots of difficult things for us to wrap our brains around in Jesus' communication there, and some things that maybe are quicker and easier to comprehend, and some other things that require some discussion, and for us to hang around a little bit longer and get into those things. But coming towards the end of chapter 17, Jesus is talking about the kingdom coming, and what that will or what that won't look like, a requirement for people to turn to God, for people to acknowledge that for there to be holiness, there needs to be a departure from wickedness, and that speaks to our own processes of Jesus making us like Him in the way that we do what we do. But Jesus says something really curious in Luke 17 verse 32. He says, "Remember Lot's wife." A strange thing to say. It's an odd thing to mention for Jesus to say, and so we need to understand what that reference is, and we need to understand why Jesus would say that. In Genesis chapter 19, we pick up the reference that Jesus is making. That's where we find what Jesus is talking about, and there is a long story that is hard for us to engage with Lot. It's not a particularly nice story. It's not a particularly fun story. It's going to challenge a lot of how we think about these things, but I would encourage you to do that. Maybe pick that up from Genesis 13, and as you can, work your way through that, get some broader understanding of what is happening when we pick up in Genesis 19 the account of Lot's wife. And Lot and his wife are leaving where they were. Again, remember and hold this idea of, for there to be holiness, there needs to be a departure from wickedness. And so that is very literally and in real time what is happening for Lot and for his wife. They are leaving a place that God is taking them out of. And Lot's wife is maybe not keen to do that. And on their process from coming out of that space and following the call of grace into something different, Lot's wife stops and she looks back. The Bible tells us that Lot's wife looked back and turned into a pillar of salt. What a weird thing to happen, what a strange thing for Jesus to reference. What on earth has this idea got to do with us and the process of change? I think it speaks to us about our potential to look back and to long and to dwell and to have this sense of gazing and dwelling upon what was. And I think what Jesus is saying, and I think what happened with Lot's wife, is that the potential is there that if we long and we gaze for what was, we can become barren and desolate. And that's a strong emotive use of language, but why do I have a confidence in using that? Well, she was turned into rather a pillar of salt. Again, strange point of reference for us. We maybe associate salt with flavor, with seasoning, with positive things, but this reference to salt is not a positive thing. Salt was used and was spread on sites to deliberately make them barren and to deliberately make them desolate. Nothing would grow on the land after salt had been spread on it. And so it's a picture of Lot's wife, and it's also a picture and speaks to us that we have to be aware of the potential to disengage from an active process of change in following Jesus. And when we stand still long enough, gazing and longing for a life that God has called us from, when we refuse to follow Jesus into the call of grace, of mercy, of love, of hope, of joy, of peace, this departure from wickedness to holiness, that if we stand and we gaze and we long for what was for long enough, we become barren and desolate. We become incapable of following Jesus, because there's nothing else that can hold our attention. If God is who he says he is, and we believe that that is true, then he is worth the exchange of moving from perhaps what we have known, perhaps where we have felt comfortable, perhaps what we have loved, and to let go of that in the pursuit of the fullness of everything that God is and that God will do for his kingdom and for his glory. I hope that is making sense for you. I hope you are tracking with that. Take some time as you gather with people this week to get into that. Find out, what does that mean? The idea of the picture of the potential of longing and gazing for something that God has called you out and away from. The more we pine for that, the greater we increase the possibility of being stuck in that space and being left incapable of the activity of following Jesus. We are going to pray. This is such an important part of who we are, such an important part of what we do, not just in these moments, but how we as communities follow Jesus and are apprenticed to him. Prayer has to become way more important to us and for us. And so we, as always and ever, will count that down in this space. We're going to take 5 minutes to pray. And I want to encourage you to ask the Spirit of God to speak to you about how we long for God ahead of anything else. Ask God to develop that appetite and that hunger in you, that awareness and that desire to want God more than we want anything else, more than we want to gaze and long for what he has brought us out from and what is leading us into, to seek him and to serve him and to love him and to know him ahead of anything else. So let's take 5 minutes and ask God to speak to you about how we long for God ahead of anything else. Let's pray. would be weird and just off of us to talk about this process of change and engage with this idea of looking to God and asking God to develop an appetite in us for us to want Him more than anything else, and then not to find a way to action that. And so for our call to action this week, I want us to think about, when we are together, what are the opportunities that are in the action of following Jesus? Who can we help? Who can we be praying with and be praying for? Where is their need, and how can I serve others in remedying that? I want us to be deliberate in sharing with each other the things that this conversation around our relationship with change and how we follow Jesus, how that leads to a point of action, that following Jesus is an active process, that we are called to action, and that we are not looking to be stood still, gazing and longing for a life that God has called us from, but we want to live in the fullness of the life that God has released us into for His glory. So who can you help? Who can you be praying with, and who can you be praying for, and where is their need, and how can we respond to that as a community this week? Engage with the resources that are around for this message, the things that are happening this week, the opportunities that we have to gather this week. Remember, wash your hands, love your neighbor, have a great week, and connect with each other along the way. All right, go well. See you soon.